President Muhammadu Buhari has assured U.S. investors of massive investment opportunities in Nigeria, especially in the non-oil sector of the economy. Buhari gave the assurance at a dialogue session with some U.S. investors, Nigerian officials, diplomats, and as well as experts from the private sector in Washington, D.C. Buhari says the outcome of the massive efforts and investments by his administration in infrastructure development and refurbishment, that is, road construction and rehabilitation, investment tax credit policy, led to the reconstruction of 21 selected federal roads, totaling 1,804.6 kilometers. Well, the president on Sunday returned to Abuja after a week-long visit to Washington, D.C., USA, where he attended the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. While in Washington, the Nigerian leader also participated actively at the U.S. Nigeria Business and Investment Forum. The Business Roundtable was organized by the American Corporate Council on Africa in conjunction with the Federal Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment. Buhari also received the Secretary General of the Abu Dhabi Forum, Sheikh Al Mahfoud bin Bayan, and his deputy, Pastor Bob Roberts of the U.S., who visited him in Washington, USA. Well, to discuss Buhari's visit to the U.S., we're being joined by an economist, Olufemi Oladehin, from our Lagos studios. Olufemi, glad to have you join us. Let's start with the president's statement that the economy of Nigeria is resilient, and then, of course, he had a lot of praise for investors who are still finding Nigeria a veritable ground to come invest in, or country.
Yes, good evening, and it's a pleasure being here. I guess the first thing to say is the president's visit to the U.S. is obviously a very good one. There are some positives to take from it, and we can start to say that perhaps this visit will signal to the rest of the world that Nigeria is indeed open for business. However, there are so many conditions that are required for investors to be comfortable to come into a country and invest on the long term. And I think that's what I heard the trade minister earlier on basically saying some of the things, and he kind of skipped around it. But those are big issues. I work in investment banking, trying to attract investment into Nigeria, and it's extremely difficult given the current policies of this government.
You would want to talk about that. I mean, why is it extremely difficult? That seems to be at variance or contradict what the president is talking about, the economy being resilient and having investors come.
Well, the facts do not support the president's assertions. FDI inflows into Nigeria over the last 5 years have diminished significantly by almost 80%. So that in itself is a clear indication that there is no increased investment coming into Nigeria. And then when you take out the oil and gas sector, those numbers are even worse. Now, these are the big issues. For investors coming into this market long term, they're looking at the safety of their investment, first from an infrastructure perspective, and secondly from the repatriation perspective. The policies of the Central Bank of Nigeria over the last 6-7 years has meant that a lot of investors are not willing to bring money into the country because of the disparity in the exchange rates and the lack of liquidity in the FX market. That is a significant problem for any investor who's coming in, who has to come in and buy, and sell their dollars to the CBN at the CBN rate. But when it's time for them to repatriate those investments, there are no dollars available to back their repatriations. So those are bigger issues for investors because if you look at the devaluation of the currency and the potential returns that investors can get from their investment, devaluation can easily wipe that out in the twinkle of an eye. The Naira officially has lost over 10% this year. And if you were to look at it from the parallel market, that number is actually closer to 50%. For any investor who's bringing money into this market, that has to be a concern.
So what should the government be doing now to encourage those investors, particularly when you talked about the challenge they have of repatriating their money, especially not being able to find enough dollars to do that?
So I think there are a few big problems actually. So and let's take it back to the fact that the real economy, the real state of the economy is such that we're still an import-dependent economy. So even for those who set up businesses here, perhaps some of their raw materials are going to have to be imported. They need FX for that, and we know what the scarcity of FX has done. The reality is that what economists have been saying to the government over the last 6-7 years is that allowed the naira to naturally find its own level. The artificial exchange rate regime that we've been running has been antithetical to any investment decisions by foreign investors because it's an artificial rate. And as long as you continue to run an artificial rate, investors are going to avoid those type of markets. Now, to add to that, the U.S. has taken a tightening policy since the beginning of the year. Interest rates have gone from 0 to over 4% at the least recent increase by the Fed. So which means there's increased competition for U.S. dollar inflows. For Nigeria to attract investment from those kind of investors, we have to be offering them higher returns, given the risk of investing in the market, and we have to be offering them some level of confidence that they are able to take their money out when they need to do that. The only way the government is able to do that is to let the currency find its current level and as close to the parallel market rates as possible. Until we do that, everyone is going to think we have an artificial exchange rate, and there's very limited upside for an investor who is coming into this market.
A very dangerous thing to do. You just talked about the fact that, I mean, most people that do business, they have to import. And we're a mono economy. If you allow the naira to float, what you're suggesting, won't that do more harm, terrible harm, than good to the nation's economy? Because that's been a talk over time.
Not necessarily. So let's take a very clear example. The Nigerian government sells crude in US dollars and converts that same crude, those same US dollars into naira at an artificial exchange rate. The reality is that the Nigerian government is officially subsidizing the currency market. People are able to arbitrage when there is a difference between the official rate and the real market rate. And that's what the government has to understand. If Nigeria earns $10 billion today from crude oil and exchanges it at $400, 400 naira or 440 from the CBN, it can exchange the same naira for 700 naira. From the CBN, if that's the official rate. That means we have a lot more naira to be able to fund our naira expenses. We're literally shooting ourselves in the foot by trying to keep an artificial exchange rate that is only being benefited by people who are arbitraging the situation and to the detriment of the rest of the market. Let me point something out to you. There is no industry in Nigeria today that prices their products off the official market. Everyone uses the real parallel market rate as the proxy for exchange. The only person who still does that today is the government of Nigeria, and the government is shortchanging itself. Look, there are going to be implications if we allow the exchange rate float. Prices are going to rise, but they're rising already. So it's the best time for you to do it. Let the currency find its own natural level. Investors will have a lot more confidence in our policies, and then we can start to see the FDIs. One thing that is clear is that if we see an increase in FDI flows, the naira will strengthen because the demand and supply argument.
All right, let's look from, let's talk about America now. The 55 billion support plan that America is talking about, is it enough, too little, or a stepping stone in the right direction, Olufemi?
Look, given the state of Africa as a continent and given the level of investment that's required for the continent to be able to reach the level of growth that can keep its young population employed at full employment, the continent needs in excess of $1 trillion over the next 10 years, every year over the next 10 years in investment for us to be able to get sustainable growth. Now, $55 billion is a drop in the ocean, but it's a good way to start. I think one of the biggest benefits of the relationship with the U.S. is that those funds don't just come in to provide investment. They also come in towards upscaling skills and ensuring that the industries are able to operate at a higher level of efficiency. That is obviously positive for the continent. Now, the key thing is, I heard the trade minister talking about it earlier on, that the conditions that were attached to the original investment were so strenuous that most African countries couldn't even meet those conditions. I think a relaxation of the conditions, countries signing up to a higher level of scrutiny and accountability, $55 billion is significant enough. That is actually larger than the Nigerian budget. So I think from an African perspective, it's a good starting point, but the continent requires a lot more investment than that.
Investment than that. All right, before I let you go, America says its partnership with Africa, what America is talking about is what they can offer. This was said by Jake Sullivan, Biden's security advisor. No more criticizing China or Russia, who are gaining inroads, but they're looking at partnership, what they can offer. That sounds good.
Oh, it's absolutely good. And you see, there's something that's even very important. Look, it's good that the rhetoric in the U.S. is changing because in the past, there was that obsession with China and Russia, as you mentioned earlier on. The rhetoric has to change. There is a competition for Africa. Africa is still the most resourced continent in the world, and resources that are required by the rest of the world for them to continue to grow. So a partnership with the U.S. is always going to be positive for Africa, especially if it is not the prescriptive partnership that we've always had. The reason why China succeeded in Africa was they were not prescribing to Africans how to live their lives. And the sanctimonious, policies of the U.S. meant that a lot of African governments avoided them. But if the U.S. starts to see Africa as an equal partner and negotiates these trade deals on the basis of equal partnership and on the basis of economic growth, on the basis of economic sustainability, I think it's positive for both continents, especially given what is happening in Europe. Africa has to be the darling of the rest of the world, and it is only to the benefit of the U.S. If it's able to solidify its relationship with the continent.
Darling of the world. That's interesting. We'll leave it there. Olufemi Oladehin, an economist. Thank you for being on the program.